I'm Congressman Andy Kim from New Jersey.
Hi, my name is Key Park. I'm an American neurosurgeon who performs surgeries in North Korea.
Hi, I'm Joy Yoon, and as a humanitarian worker, I help children with disabilities in North Korea.
I am Rick Downs, President and Executive Director of the Coalition of Families of Korean and Cold War POW MIAs.
I am Chun Lim, one of thousands of Korean American families with loved ones in North Korea.
My name is Joseph Bernstein. I was a second lieutenant during the Korean War.
My name is James Butcher.
Dear President Biden and all in Congress,
it's time to end the Korean War so that Korean families can be reunited.
A new era of peace would bring improved health to the entire population of North Korea.
A way to bring meaning to our family sacrifice and the sacrifice of so many others is to find prosperity and unification for the Korean people.
The United States has a moral obligation to finally and formally bring an end to the Korean War.
I want to see an end to the Korean War because it's time that we move forward and envision a future of peace.
By having both sides decide to end this conflict and sign a peace treaty, this would be in the interest of not only their own country, but the world at large.
Peace is a prerequisite for health, and I am calling for Korea peace now.
From a humanitarian perspective, there is nothing more important than Korea peace now.
please, please end the Korean War.
I would love to see the end of the Korean War.
I'm calling for Korea peace now.
I am calling for Korea peace now.
I'm Donmi Che, and I support Korea peace now.
I'm Jian Yang, and I support Korea peace now.
I am Justice Jung, and I support Korea peace now.
Great. Thank you, all of us and all of you, for joining us for this really important webinar on the dangerous situation in Korea and what we can do to direct the standoff towards a peaceful resolution. My name is Christine Ahn, and I'm the Executive Director of Women Across DMC. We're a movement of women mobilizing globally for peace in Korea. That was a short video that's on our website of the movement, the broad movement that is with us, veterans, children of US servicemen still looking for their families, divided families, Korean Americans, and all of you that make up this beautiful, diverse movement. Today, I'm joined by three speakers. We are first joined by Representative Andy Kim, who joined Brad Sherman today in reintroducing the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act in Congress. We will then hear from Colleen Moore about our congressional strategy, and then for Professor Jae Jung-suh on the geopolitical context. We should all be concerned about what is happening in Korea and in the region because it impacts us all. But we are not helpless. We can all play a role in preventing war and building peace. This July 27th marks the 70th anniversary of the Armistice Agreement, which temporarily halted but did not permanently end the Korean War. On July 27th, 1953, the military commanders of the US, of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and China met at Panmunjom at the DMZ, where they promised to put down their weapons and return within 90 days to negotiate a political settlement. Sadly, that never happened. And as a result, the US and North Korea have been locked in a perpetual state of war. Due to the mutual defense treaties between the US and South Korea and between North Korea and China, another conflict on the peninsula could trigger a nuclear war and impact millions. In just this year alone, North Korea has tested multiple long-range missiles, displaying its ability to overwhelm the US's missile defense system. And the US and South Korea are ramping up joint military exercises this month. South Korea's conservative president Yoon Suk-yeol is now toying with the idea of reintroducing nuclear weapons into South Korea. And as the US justifies increasing its military presence throughout the Asia Pacific region to counter rising authoritarianism, the Biden administration is strengthening alliances with governments that are actually weakening democracy. In South Korea, President Yoon has cracked down against trade unions and civil society groups that are challenging his repressive policies using the Cold War national security law. So much so that South Korea fell 8 points in the democracy index since last year. The backdrop to this endless cycle of provocations is the US-China great power competition, which has put Korea on its front line. What will it take for the Biden administration to resume talks with North Korea and ultimately remove the threat of the renewed war that has plagued 80 million Korean people for more than 7 decades? What can we do as ordinary citizens to take collective action to compel our elected officials to do what is right and is long overdue by ending America's oldest war in Korea? Before we turn to our speakers, I would like to ground us in the significance of today's date to the Korean people. On March 1st, 1919, after more than a decade of brutal colonial occupation by Japan, during which time Koreans were forced to speak Japanese, take Japanese names, and live in squalid conditions, 33 Korean leaders gathered in Seoul and read aloud a declaration for Korean independence. This call for action sparked a nationwide movement in which more than 1 million people took to the streets in protest. Despite the nonviolent nature of these protests, the Japanese colonial police called in the Japanese Army and the Navy to brutally crack down on the protesters, killing more than 7,500 people and arresting 45,000. In one instance, the Japanese rounded up several hundred protesters, locked them in a church, and burned it to the ground. While the March 1st movement didn't succeed in overthrowing the Japanese colonizers, it did strengthen Korean unity and helped to inspire similar uprisings around the world in China, the Philippines, Ireland, Egypt, and eventually in India, where Gandhi led the nonviolent movement for independence. In many ways, Korea is still wrestling with the legacy of that period, a divided people, the presence of foreign troops, and being caught in the crossfire of great powers. The difference is that today we are more interconnected than ever, and we recognize that the security of the Korean people is tied to the security of Americans, and that we must achieve peace through non-military means. Here in the US, we can build the political will for peace and pressure the Biden administration to engage North Korea and replace the ceasefire with a peace agreement. And we will do that through the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. So now we're here to listen to Representative Andy Kim on the reintroduction of this historic bill. Representative Kim.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Andy. Good to see y'all. I'm excited to be able to push forward on this legislation and just continue to push forward on this effort to really look at the Korean Peninsula for what it is today and what it can be, not what it was 70 years ago, not what it was during the Cold War. And I really kind of approach it in that kind of direction. I really think through initially just a sense of does the labeling of the Korean War, does the armistice, does that reflect where things are today? Does that reflect the reality of the situation? And I feel all the more strong about this after my visit out to South Korea last year. I was able to go out to South Korea. This is my first time to be able to return to my ancestral homeland as a sitting United States member of Congress, as a Korean American member of Congress. It was a very powerful experience. And being able to go and visit, being able to go up to the DMZ, and to be able to just understand where things are at today and just what reality we're facing. And it just continued to hit home to me that we are continuing to look through the situation on the Korean Peninsula right now through that lens of the Cold War, of the Korean War, of decades ago. And it's hurting our ability to really see things for where they're at, and to come up with innovative new ideas and new solutions to some of the challenges that we face. I see it in Congress, where I see colleagues of mine just continuing to think that everything has just been frozen on the Korean Peninsula over the last 70 years, and continuing to just see things through that lens, which again hurts their ability to understand what is the reality and where our focus and priorities should be. So that's something that I just really think through, is just this need for us to modernize and to update our reality and our understanding of that reality on the Korean Peninsula, to be able to make sure that we can look at the US South Korea relationship for what it is, not just thinking about it as some byproduct of concerns about North Korea or China or other challenges that we face, but to really look at it for what it is, to recognize the strategic value that is there beyond the commitments that were made decades ago. So that's something that I feel very strongly about. The second thing I would just say is, in addition to thinking through, does this reflect the current reality? The second question is what makes us and what makes the Korean Peninsula safer? And would taking certain actions reduce that security or increase that security? And I really do believe that, look, there are real legitimate security concerns that we are facing. I don't want this to be seen as something that is not looking at that and recognizing some of those challenges that we face in the Korean Peninsula and more broadly in the region. But the question is what is going to make it safer? And I really, again, just believe that taking these actions of seeing things for where they are right now and talking about this in a way where we recognize the end of the Korean War, it's not going to make things less secure. In fact, we can update and move forward in terms of what we think is necessary to be able to bring about the kind of a secure system and secure environment that I certainly would want for my family living out there in South Korea still, and for others. But we can do it in a way that looks at the threats and looks at the challenges that we see again today, and not just putting everything through that lens of where things were at decades ago. And I really think that would help us really bring that conversation to the next level, and then also open up a whole nother category and a whole nother wave of thinking about what the US and South Korea partnership can mean when we don't look at everything through that funnel and that filter of the Korean War, of that type of lens. So, this is something that now I've been in Congress about a little over 4 years, and I just feel more strongly than ever that this is something that needs to happen, that a reframing and a revitalized and renewed understanding of the US relationship to Korea is necessary. And I think that would make us both stronger as well as safer going forward on a lot of levels. So I know other folks are going to chime in and give their thoughts, but I wanted to just give you my honest reflections as I've thought through this and traveled out to Korea, talked to my colleagues in Congress, and reflected on this in a number of different ways. I'm hopeful that we can bring this about, and I'm hopeful that will usher in a new era of relations between the United States and Korea. So thanks everyone for giving me an opportunity to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Congressman Andy Kim, for being such a tireless Korea peace champion and for all your work to improve our security here at home. We're so lucky to have such an incredible leader like you in Congress representing the American people. Thank you so much. Now we'll hear from Colleen Moore, who is our advocacy director at Women Cross DMC, on the congressional dynamics in Washington and why the Korea Peninsula Act, Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, is such an important tool for building the political will for peace with North Korea. Colleen is a policy advocacy and campaign strategist with tremendous experience leading campaigns on progressive foreign policy and national security issues. Her analysis and commentary have been featured in publications such as NK News, The Hill, The National Interest, Common Dreams, and Miss Magazine. Please join us in welcoming Colleen to share her insight. Thanks, Colleen.
Yes, thank you so much, Christine. And thank you to Congressman Andy Kim and to Brad Sherman for your steadfast support for peace in Korea and for reintroducing this important bill. And I also want to thank the 20 original co-sponsors who joined Congressman Sherman in introducing this bill this morning. So the reintroduction of the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act marks the first time that a bill on peace in Korea has been reintroduced. In the last Congress, 46 members of Congress, including Sherman, supported the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. The bill calls for diplomacy with North Korea to formally end the Korean War, a comprehensive review of travel restrictions to North Korea, and the establishment of liaison offices in the US and North Korea. It was the first bill calling for an end to the Korean War, following the success of the first House resolution, HRes 152, which was introduced by Representative Ro Khanna in the 116th Congress. To have 46 co-sponsors on the bill in the midst of a stalemate in talks and escalating military provocations is such an amazing achievement that really demonstrates congressional support for a new U.S. approach toward North Korea. The bill received support from both sides of the aisle, including 6 members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and many previous co-sponsors of HRes 152 also supported this bill, as well as new champions. And I will also say the bill that was reintroduced today is also bipartisan and has support on both sides of the aisle. The political dynamics have definitely changed in this Congress, with the House of Representatives now controlled by the Republicans. But ultimately, what we're really aiming for is to have this issue on the political agenda. Without this movement, this issue may not even be in the mix. We've created this massive paradigm shift. 10 years ago, there were only 2 members of Congress who would speak on this issue. And now we had over 50 co-sponsors of HRes 152 and almost 50 on the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act last Congress. And building the political will starts with Congress as representatives of the American people. While the president could formally end the Korean War through executive powers alone, congressional support is critical in building support for a long-lasting peace agreement, demonstrating that multiple branches of the U.S. government support forging a new relationship with North Korea and ending this war. So that's why the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act is the main legislative vehicle we are using to demonstrate support for the issue. For leadership to take this bill up in committee, which is the first step to move this bill through the process to become law, building co-sponsorship can serve to show House leadership, especially in the Foreign Affairs Committee, that there is support for ending the war. And that's why we need you to call on your representative to co-sponsor the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. We're targeting movable Democratic members, including progressive freshman members and members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as districts where we have grassroots people power. We have been so successful in the past and will continue to be in the future because of our inside-outside advocacy strategy, with our DC advocacy always being coordinated with grassroots mobilization. Women Cross DMZ's advocacy team works closely in lockstep with the Korea Peace Now grassroots network to coordinate lobby meetings and other actions in key districts with constituents. On the DC advocacy side, there are so many national organizations, part of our DC North Korea Legislative Coalition, made up of nuclear disarmament, peace, and humanitarian groups, as well as media partners and think tanks who are working to galvanize support for the bill and other legislation related to peace in Korea in order to change this conversation in DC. In the Korea Peace Network, which is composed of peace, social justice, human rights, faith, veterans, and Korean American groups and individuals advocating for peace on the Korean Peninsula have also been pivotal in securing congressional support. This movement is truly democracy in action. Foreign policy issues tend to be framed as disconnected from everyday lives of Americans, but this movement for peace in Korea is democratizing foreign policy, bringing stories of those affected by the unended Korean War straight to the doors of policymakers in Washington, D.C. We have heard so many times from congressional offices that they have become a champion on this issue because of hearing constituent stories of the effects of decades of war and separation from their family in North Korea. I want to stress again that the reason we've been successful is because all of you on this call right now who are a part of this people-powered movement to end the Korean War. This movement is mighty and growing. The people of this movement include Korean American activists, many of them part of divided families, who long to close this chapter of war and be reunited with their loved ones in North Korea, as well as longtime peace activists who have spent their lives resisting war and militarism, humanitarian workers and faith leaders who have traveled to North Korea for decades, veterans who have seen firsthand the horrific effects of war, and so many fresh new faces, like students mobilizing on their campuses to recruit new people into the movement. Just a few years ago, I myself was new to the movement, meeting the Women Cross DMZ team at the DC launch of the Korea Peace Now international campaign. I was so amazed and intrigued by the idea of a women-led, people-powered movement for peace in Korea. In DC, you don't always see a lot of teams led by women who are powered by the very people who are affected by this issue. I then traveled to the DMZ in April 2019, the one-year anniversary of the Panmunjom Declaration made between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in. Seeing firsthand the division of the Korean Peninsula and how the division and the persistence of war affects the people of Korea really cemented my involvement in this movement and my dedication to ending this war once and for all. It's time to open a new chapter of US-North Korea relations. So what can you do to join this movement? So whether you're a longtime seasoned activist or if this is the first time you're hearing about the movement, you can take action now by calling on your representative to co-sponsor the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. So you can click on the link that will be in the chat and to send to your representative. We encourage you to personalize your email as well, adding any details about why you support this bill. And then later in the call, we'll make some important announcements involved further this year. Need more people in this movement to build constituencies to call for peace. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to Christine.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for that great pep talk about what we can do as a community nationwide to see a final end to this Korean War. So thank you so much, Colleen, for all your hard work and advocacy. Now, on the rapidly changing geopolitical context and why this is perhaps among the most dangerous times that could spark an accidental or intentional war. Professor Suh teaches politics and international studies at International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan. He's currently a visiting scholar at Harvard Yenching Institute in Boston. He served as the Associate Professor and Director of Korea Studies at SAIS at Johns Hopkins, and as Assistant Professor in the Department of Government at Cornell. Professor Suh is the author of several books, including Power, Interest, and Identity in Military Alliances from 2007, Rethinking Security in East Asia, Identity, Power, and Efficiency, Truth and Reconciliation in the Republic of Korea Between the Present and Future of the Korean Wars, and The Origins of North Korea's Juche, Colonialism, War, and Development. he clearly brings decades of analysis and insight onto the Korean Peninsula. But just as importantly, he's such a kind and great friend. So thank you so much, JJ, for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Christine, for your very kind to speak at this important event. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Congressman Kim for introducing the historic Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act to Congress today. And thank you all for coming to this important webinar. I'm honored to participate in this webinar today on the 104th anniversary of the March 1st movement that more than 100 years ago, Koreans demanded independence from colonialism as a vital step toward peace in Asia and the world. And this is very relevant to today's world. Happy and excited I am to join you on this auspicious day when the Korea Peace Bill was introduced to Congress. In my presentation, so if you could start the slides. My presentation is titled The Rise of First Strike Threats, because all the major powers in Northeast Asia are pursuing a first strike capability and are adding to the instability. The region is now standing on a threshold of an unprecedented level of instability and crisis. So first, I'll go over briefly security policies pursued by North Korea, South Korea, the US, and Japan to analyze their doctrines and capabilities. Second, I'll situate all of these in the context of the Korean War. And finally, I'll end my presentation by explaining how the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Bill will help end the Korean War, as well as how it'll also help diffuse the contemporary crisis. Next slide, please. So what is North Korea doing? Well, it has shifted its nuclear doctrine from no first strike to a first use doctrine. The shift was made clear and public in the law adopted in September of last year. And in the act titled On Nuclear Forces Policy, North Koreans laid out conditions under which they could use nuclear weapons. And they listed 5 conditions, of which we can take a look at the second one. And they specifically said nuclear or non-nuclear attack against national leadership and nuclear forces command has begun. So in other words, if nuclear weapon attack has begun, North Koreans would retaliate with nuclear capability. But also, even if non-nuclear attack is started, North Korea will retaliate with a nuclear attack. So it's a clear first use of a nuclear weapons doctrine. Furthermore, this law clearly indicated that even if a war has not broken out, North Korean leadership can decide whether a war is imminent. And if it decides that an attack is imminent, then it can use nuclear weapons against that adversary. So this is a very clear statement that it could use nuclear weapons when there is a war, but it can use nuclear weapons even if there is no war, if North Korean leadership decides that an attack is imminent. Next slide, please. So does North Korea have the capability to pull off this kind of a first use doctrine? Yes, it does. It certainly has nuclear warheads and delivery systems. As far as delivery systems, it has ICBMs that you see on the far right side of this chart. And the one highlighted with the red line is an ICBM that can strike just about everywhere in continental USA. And the one to the left is another ICBM that was actually test fired just earlier last month. And these two missiles can be used to deliver nuclear warheads to anywhere in the continental USA. Furthermore, North Koreans are developing other types of missiles that could be used against our bases in Guam, Hawaii, or Japan. And these are missiles in the second red box in this table. And this red table shows what they call hypervelocity missiles, as well as missiles that can be launched from a submarine. Further to the left, I have two red boxes, and the red box shows a missile that can be used for tactical purposes against South Korean targets. And so North Korea has delivery systems that can deliver nuclear warheads not only to South Korea, but also to targets in Japan, Guam, Hawaii, and the continental USA. Next slide, please. Furthermore, they are enhancing their delivery capabilities. They are not only developing submarine launch ballistic missiles, but they are now deploying them in lakes. And this makes it virtually impossible to detect these missiles before they can be launched. And so preemptive strikes by South Korea, Japan, or the US would be made all but impossible by this kind of deployment. Second, the picture on the right shows a new type of missile engine. And the ICBMs that I showed in the previous slide use liquid fuel, which takes time to get the missile ready. But solid fuel does not require any preparation time. Solid fuel missiles can be deployed and launched without much preparation time. And so North Koreans are now developing a solid fuel engine that can be used for ICBMs so that they can be launched without being detected by the US or South Korea. Next slide, please. So why is it that North Korea is developing this kind of capabilities, as well as a first strike doctrine? Well, first of all, North Korea is engaged in the Korean War. And obviously, they are preparing to fight a war that has been ongoing for the past 73 years. Furthermore, South Korea is outpacing North Korea. As Congressman Andy Kim suggested in his remark, South Korea is way ahead in terms of its economic development, modernization, and the cultural advancement. So much so that its military spending is 10 times as large as North Korea's. As a matter of fact, South Korea's military spending is larger than twice North Korea's GDP, according to our own State Department's report. In other words, even if North Korea spends all its economic activities for military purposes, it cannot match South Korea. And that's why North Korea is turning to what's characterized as asymmetric capability, missiles and nuclear weapons. But now that North Korea is developing missiles and nuclear weapons, South Korea is developing countermeasures. And they call it 3-axis and 4-axis now under the Yoon government. These are capabilities that would neutralize North Korean missiles before they can be launched, that will neutralize North Korean missiles during the flight, and finally, that will destroy North Korea's command centers and leadership after their use of missiles. And South Korea is developing what they call decapacitation capabilities. In other words, they are developing military units and weapon systems that can be used to destroy the regime, to bring about the end of the regime. And therefore, North Korea is now feeling threatened by this development. And as a result, they are developing missiles that could evade South Korea's missile defense systems, that could evade South Korea's ability for preemptive strikes and so forth. And so the ongoing Korean War is fueling arms race between North Korea and South Korea, and the arms race is reaching really dangerous stage now. Next slide, please. So what does the US have to do with this? Everything. Because the US is an important party to the Korean War from the beginning, and it remains so. And furthermore, the US has been providing for what's known as the extended deterrence, which basically means the US is threatening North Korea with a threat to use nuclear weapons against the regime. And the US has a specific policy of extended deterrence called tailored deterrence that is basically tailored to end North Korean regime if North Korea threatens the safety of South Koreans or Japanese. And our policy of tailored deterrence is apparently working, and working too well. In fact, it's working so well, North Koreans are so threatened, and as a result, they are developing their own countermeasures. And the US has all these capabilities, of course, that could be employed to actually implement its policy of tailored deterrence. Next slide, please. But what about Japan? Isn't Japan a peace nation that is bound by the peace constitution? Yes, it is. But it is also indirect party to the Korean War. Japan was an integral part of the Korean War during the active phase of the conflict from 1950 to 53, because it headquartered the UNC command, and it has remained as an integral part of the Korean War because it still maintains bases and capabilities that would be used in a contingency in the Korean Peninsula. And furthermore, Kishida government last year adopted a new security policy by which it is now pursuing counter-strike capability. It is a capability that would strike the enemy base before the enemy could strike Japan. And it was prompted by North Korea's development of missile and nuclear capabilities. And so alarmed by North Korea's development, Japan decided that it would have to acquire capabilities that could strike North Korean missiles and weapons of mass destruction before they could be used against Japan. And so Japan is increasing its military budget. And this kind of a change in strategy and the increase in military capability are prompted by North Korean development, but it has an obvious implication for another country in the region and for the region as a whole. And more specifically, Japan is planning to acquire Tomahawk missiles and upgrade its own missile systems. Next slide, please. So what do these developments have to do with the Korean War? Everything. Because North Korea, South Korea, the US, Japan are doing all of these things precisely because they are entangled in the Korean War. And they are preparing to fight the war. And as they do so, they increase their capabilities and they enhance their weapon systems. And that's exactly what we are seeing. And the escalation is really reaching the most dangerous phase that I have ever seen in my career. And so it's perhaps the longest war and tragic war, but it has a potential to result in more tragedies that we have not seen ever. And it's particularly important that we remember that the current crisis and instability is a manifestation of the war. And the current crisis is a symptom of an illness. And the name of the illness is the Korean War. Next slide, please. So in order to solve the current crisis, we need to cure the illness, the Korean War. We have to end the Korean War. But at this point, some of you might say, well, didn't North Korean leader say that he'll never give up nuclear weapons and he's not interested in negotiations? Yes, he said so. Specifically on September 8th last year, when the People's Assembly adopted this war on nuclear weapons, Kim Jong-un made a speech where he said specifically, and I quote, "We can never give up the nuclear weapons." But that sentence was followed by more important sentence, and I quote, "If our nuclear policy is to be changed now, the world has to be changed. And so should the political and military environment on the Korean Peninsula," unquote. In other words, this is Kim Jong-un's way of saying that if situations on the peninsula changes, then his policy on the nuclear weapons and the war can change. And this is something important to keep in mind, because it at least leaves open the possibility of engaging the North Koreans in diplomacy. And we have had a number of negotiations that have not really resulted in a success. And one of the important causes of their limits was that Congress was not actively engaged in any of these past negotiations. And so the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act is all the more important because it clearly demonstrates congressional will, and congressional will to support peace, congressional will to end the Korean War. And that gives a strong basis on which the executive branch can sit down in a negotiation for peace and denuclearization. And so the bill is important not only for its contribution to ending the old war, but also because it has a great potential to diffuse the current crisis and instability and open a space for diplomacy, for peace and denuclearization. So thank you, Congressman Kim, for introducing this important bill. And thank you, everyone, for coming to this webinar to show your support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, JJ, for that alarming analysis, but also some glimmers of possibility that we could actually turn this dangerous situation around. For those of you that have a question, please post it on the Q&A. Before I turn to those questions, I want to announce that Women Across DMZ, the Korea Peace Now grassroots network, of which there are over 10 regional chapters nationwide, and the Korean American Peace Fund are partnering with several longtime allies to organize a national mobilization this July 27th and 28th in Washington, D.C., where we will hold a congressional briefing with our Korea Peace champions. We'll rally at the White House, and we'll gather for a day-long conference to learn and strategize together on how to finally end this war. We're going to post a link in this chat where people can sign up to join and participate in this national mobilization. 73 years is enough. I think we would all agree. And that if we don't pressure President Biden and our elected officials to do the right thing, we might as well accept that the Korean War will never end, that Koreans will be forever divided, and that the specter of renewed war will always loom over the Korean Peninsula. I don't think any one of us wants to accept that fate, which is why we are here, which is why we must do everything we can to change the course of history. I want to announce some good news. To help Americans understand that the Korean War is a US war, and that is upon our government in Washington to help bring closure to this war. We're anticipating the documentary film Crossings by Emmy Award-winning filmmaker Deanne Bourchier-Lean will be broadcast nationally around the anniversary of the armistice. That means that this critical history of the Korean War and the devastating consequences on so many lives will reach hundreds, if not millions of viewers. We hope to host at least 70 watch parties nationally. So we need all of you to sign up now, to gather your friends and your family to learn about this conflict and our women-led movement for peace. So we're going to put that link into the chat. So now we'll turn to questions, and please remember to post your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start with a question to JJ. As we all know, this is the year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what has been the impact of this war on peace and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? JJ.
Yes, it has had a polarizing and negative effect on the peninsula, because North Korea has made its policy clear that it'll stand with Russia on this war, and it's even possible that North Korea sent some material assistance to North Korea, as the State Department has indicated. And so the divide between South Korea and North Korea has become even deeper and more polarized by the Ukraine war, and the looming second Cold War is deepening in Northeast Asia as a result of the Ukraine war. Having said that, I also want to emphasize that North Korean leadership from Kim Il-sung all the way to Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un has consistently expressed its desire to build peace with the US and normalize its relationship. And so Kim Il-sung specifically stated to former President Carter that he desired to have a normalization of relationship with the US. And if that happens, then the US troop could stay in South Korea. And Kim Jong-il also stated the same in his summit meeting with South Korean leader, then South Korean leader Kim Dae-jung. And Kim Jong-un also said in his earlier years in the leadership position that it was the will of the predecessors that North Korea wants to normalize its relationship and denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. And so if Congress follows through with this peace on Korea bill, and administration uses this as a basis on which to offer a negotiating possibility, then I think it's certainly possible that North Korea will come back, and that will, I think, increase pressure on Putin in an indirect way. And so this bill, I think, has great impact, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but also on Ukraine war and global condition.
Great, thank you, JJ. My next question is to Colleen, and there's several questions in the Q&A related to this question, which is about the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. What is the significance of the reintroduction? Was it there was a question that was it introduced in Congress? Yes, it was today. But if you could tell us a little bit more, the other question. So Colleen.
Yes, so it is unprecedented that a bill calling for an end to the Korean War has been reintroduced. This is the first time that legislation on Korea peace has been reintroduced, which, yes, it was reintroduced at a press conference this afternoon on the Hill in Washington, D.C. with Congressman Sherman and Congressman Correa also joined us briefly. So it is substantively the same text. There was a minor addition clarifying that negotiating a peace agreement will not necessitate the removal of U.S. troops in South Korea. So substantively, it does not change anything about what the bill is calling for. It just clarifies that these two issues are pursuant to different legal instruments, as the removal of troops would be under amending the Mutual Defense Treaty. And I think part of it is also acknowledging that, you know, the peace agreement is a first step. It's really about changing the overall U.S. approach. And I think our long-lasting vision of peace would mean removal of troops from South Korea, but just under this current bill, they are pursuant to different legal instruments. So that was the only reason that was added, just to clarify that. So it is substantively the same text. So I think our advocacy largely stays the same. And I do think it is really unprecedented because interest in this issue tends to peak when there are diplomatic breakthroughs or escalations that are worrying and could lead to further provocations. For example, media attention and congressional interest definitely increased at the beginning of Trump's presidency during the fire and fury era of 2017, when he threatened to unleash fire and fury against North Korea. And administration officials said that a preemptive military strike was still on the table. And that united many in Congress and in the field to call for preventing the Trump administration from conducting a preemptive strike on North Korea. And this was, of course, followed by diplomatic breakthroughs between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, as well as between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. And this period of diplomacy is when that first House resolution on ending the Korean War was introduced in early 2019, when there was still a possibility of the US and North Korea breaking through in this diplomacy period. But as we know, we need to continue that momentum, especially when there is a stalemate in talks, to call for a resumption of diplomacy and a peace-first approach. To have almost 50 co-sponsors during stalling of talks, and to have Congressman Sherman and 20 others reintroduce this bill, it shows that we have kept up that momentum and that congressional support has not waned during this difficult time. So many, like Congressman Andy Kim and others, they have stood for Korea peace for years and continue to call for a new approach. And that's a testament to this movement for Korea peace that has not wavered, and if anything, is growing bigger and stronger. And it's not an issue on the fringes of political conversations. We have so many mainstream validators on our side, like Secretary of Defense William Perry and former President Jimmy Carter, who have also called for peace in Korea. And as you saw on the video at the beginning of this call, we work with so many humanitarians and veterans and so many others who support a new US approach. So as Congressman Kim said in his remarks, it is time to close this chapter and move on from what the situation was 70 years ago. It's time to end the Korean War, and this reintroduction of the bill is an opportunity to mobilize and call on the administration to finally end the war.
Thanks so much, Colleen. I think that we're having some technical difficulties with Professor Saw, so hopefully he'll be able to join us for the last few minutes of our webinar. But there is a Korean Peninsula Act is from HR 3446.
Yeah, I don't think we know the number of it yet. I think it was going to be published later this afternoon.
Okay, great. There's a question about how can North Korea provide their congressional offices with relevant information to help increase their co-sponsorship? What kinds of educational resources would be the most impactful from a congressional perspective? Maybe you can try to answer that one, Colleen, and put in some links.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think the biggest thing that congressional offices care about is their constituents, of course. And, I think as re-election happens every few years, eyes are always on how members can get re-elected. And so they want to know that their constituents care about these issues. So I think that is the biggest thing I think we can be doing in our congressional advocacy, is translating those personal stories from constituents, really that democratization of foreign policy, like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, of bringing those stories directly to policy. Released a report in 2021, Path to Peace, that outlines why we are advocating for a peace agreement from a wide variety of angles of, why on the denuclearization front it's important, human rights, kind of outlines why a peace agreement as opposed to other legal instruments. So we can definitely drop that in the chat as well. I think that congressional offices appreciate seeing, especially the executive summary that kind of hits the high points. And I think that's the second point of advocacy in congressional offices. I think always having those short one-pagers is very important. Congressional offices are always quite inundated with a lot of meetings, a lot of requests, and they definitely can't fully dive into every topic that they're approached about. So having something really short, really concise that hits the high points of, these are the 3 things that the bill does. This is, 3 reasons why we support this. I think it's always important to keep it short and concise. So we can definitely, drop that in the chat for people to use in your advocacy.
Great, thanks so much, Colleen. I know we're just about out of time. I did want to ask one last question to JJ. And I did want to quickly respond to a question that came from Ryan about, well, why can Americans go to North Korea? And we've gotten some signals that North Korea may be opening up. We know that the World Food Program is hoping to send quadruple their shipments in food aid to North Korea. So But the challenges for Americans is going to North Korea, because in 2017, Trump instituted a travel ban on Americans from going to North Korea. And there are these very narrow exceptions for who can get a special validation passport. And that's a very cumbersome process. So we, if you go to the Korea Peace Now website, there is Lift the Travel Ban. There's a little campaign. So if you wanted to join, we need all of your support. And hopefully the State Department will do the right thing and either lift the ban or make some important modifications. That could include, for example, divided Korean Americans from seeing their families. So I know we're out of time, but there were multiple questions on this issue, which is about, and JJ, maybe it's better to just do the audio since the video is kind of challenged, but it's the question about China. And it's the question about the impact of the US-China great power competition on prospects for peace on the Korean Peninsula. So, you know, Tasha, for example, asked a question about the escalating tensions with China and how that impacts peace on the Korean Peninsula. And Hayden wrote in saying that he's just detected some hesitancy from his member of Congress to support the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act on the grounds that it would hinder, quote, US strategic competition with China. So what can we do? How do we counter this kind of Cold War framework? And knowing that the Korean War was actually the war where American and Chinese troops fought each other. We know Mao Zedong's son was killed in that war. So JJ, could you respond to that question?
Yes. And let me apologize for keeping my camera off. Harvard has many wonderful things, but it has a really faulty outlet and unstable internet connection. So let me just speak without the camera. And of course, the strategy competition with China makes it all the more difficult to, think about other things and other areas of cooperation. But I think it's Biden administration's policy. There is a common interest and compete where interests diverge. And I think peace on the peninsula is one of a few areas, together with the environment, where the US and China have a common interest. And China has consistently, supported peace and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And the US has also done so. And so I think, again, this bill has many implications on many different levels, but it's not only about the Korean Peninsula per se, but working on the Korean Peninsula peace, I think has a potential to bring China and the US together and create at least one area of cooperation. And I think that can only have a positive effect on the overall strategy competition. That in itself we cannot do much about, but I think peace on the peninsula again is one of the few issues where China and the US have a common interest, and I think we should highlight that as an area of cooperation.
Great, thank you so much, JJ. And Colleen, for all of your insights. I want to close by, there was a question from David Hawk about why, I think, it was kind of related to the agreed framework, which was the historic agreement that the Clinton administration negotiated with North Korea that froze its nuclear weapons program for over a decade, and which was successful, but then the Clinton administration faced resistance in a Republican-led Congress. And so I think that is really important for why this Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act is exciting, it's important, and I think is the important political tool to ensure that whatever peace agreement that President Biden is able to negotiate with North Korea will have some political support within the Congress so that they won't put up obstacles to advancing peace. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this important webinar. And please sign up to join us for the national mobilization this July in Washington, D.C. We're anticipating hundreds coming from around the country, and also to host a screening party of Deanne Borchardt-Lean's film Crossings, which is incredibly inspiring about people power, women-led peace movements, but also the important history of the unresolved Korean War and the impact on so many people's lives. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to the incredible team at Women Cross DMZ for all the behind the scenes. And thank you, Representative Andy Kim, Colleen Moore, and JJ for sharing all of your important insights and analysis with us. So stay tuned for more information. See you next time.